Good morning, everyone. Good to see you again. So before we get started, I thought it would be useful to just do a very quick overview of how we do the census. We're going to be walking through all of this today, and it's a quick snapshot of the key things that we do when we conduct a decennial census. We begin with the address list. The address list, and this is down on the left-hand corner, we call this slide our ARC slide. We use it a lot, but the address list is a list of all of the addresses in the entire country. It's the foundation of a census. We say that an accurate address list leads to an accurate census. The address list gives us control. It's through the address list that we know every household that we're contacting, and then we track what's coming in, and we know what addresses have not yet responded, and that's where we send interviewers out during a later phase. We also mount a strong, vigorous address list development. Motivation campaign. It's a communications and partnership program. I touched on this last night. Stephen Buckner at lunch will be walking through that promotional campaign. We then move into the self-response phase, where we've contacted every household one way or another, and we are asking them to respond to the census. We usually get about 60%. We estimate 60% of the population will respond during self-response. They can respond in 3 ways. Al Fontenot will be talking about that operation. We talked a little bit yesterday about the extraordinary lengths we go to reach everyone. We touched on what we do in hurricane-hit areas. We touched on what we do with the homeless. There's actually a variety of operations that we do to get to everyone, all the people who live in situations other than traditional housing units. Al Fontenot will talk about the group quarters operation when he talks later this morning. And then we move into non-response follow-up, the biggest and most expensive part of the census, where we send people out to knock on doors and interview the people who are living there. We do a few other operations in that phase as well. And finally, and Al will talk about that, and finally, we tabulate the data and release the census results. And James Whitehorn will touch on how that works. And he's also going to talk about redistricting. I touched on last night that one of the stakes of the census is the redistricting data that is received by the states. James runs the operation that reaches all of the states and gets the data to them that they need. Our apportionment counts are due. Census Day, you'll remember, is April 1st of the year ending 0. Our apportionment counts are due by the 31st of that year, and that's when all these operations happen. And then our redistricting data is due to the states by March 31st. So moving on. Through every decade, we develop our design of the census, and we conduct the research and testing that leads us to the operational design that we're going to implement when we conduct the census. As we embarked on our, I call this the road to the 2020 census, as we embarked on the road to the 2020 census, we focused on 4 key innovation areas. These are innovation areas that Margot talked a little bit about last night, that I talked a little bit about. I just want to walk through them very quickly because you're going to see the operations that have been built around this innovation effort. And again, as I talked about our stakeholders last night, we were guided in this by the scientists, the scholars that help us develop the census design. The National Academy of Sciences had a panel that was in place from very early in the decade, directing our efforts, working with us to enhance our efforts as we built this design. We looked at 4 key innovation areas. One, and most of this has to do with leveraging technology and in effect bringing the census design out of the paper and pencil way that we did the census up through 2010 into our current environment, leveraging technology, leveraging digital technology to bring efficiencies and improvements to the way we conduct the census. The first phase that we explored was the re-engineering of address canvassing. Deirdre will talk about how we now do address canvassing differently. Address canvassing is the process of checking and ensuring that the address list is as accurate and as complete as possible. And leveraging technology to do that, leveraging the relationships we build with not just the U.S. Postal Service, but state and local governments all over the country, is key to how we do address canvassing now, and it's given us a very strong address list. I think it's one of the strongest ever. I think we're comfortable saying that, and Deirdre will talk shortly about that. We are optimizing self-response. That's about leveraging the internet, but it's also about ensuring that people have 3 ways to respond, not just by returning a paper questionnaire as they've done in past censuses, but by responding via the internet, responding via the telephone as options as well. We like internet response, so we will emphasize that in our design. Internet response gives us better data. It's cheaper for us. It's more efficient to get responses over the internet. It gives us some other options as well, and again, Al will talk about that. We also spent a lot of time this decade exploring how we can utilize administrative records and third-party data. Administrative records are data that people have already turned over to the government. They've turned it over through their IRS returns. They've turned it over, it exists in the Social Security database, Medicare, Medicaid, the Indian Health Services. There are, in fact, 14 files that we're drawing from as we look at ways to utilize administrative records, and it's in the non-response follow-up operation where we're applying them in new ways. Non-response follow-up, again, is when we send interviewers out to interview the households that don't respond to the census. That's the most expensive, by far, the most expensive component of the census. And by applying administrative records, we can pull households out of the non-response follow-up universe. We call it the NRFU universe. You'll hear Al talk about this. We can more efficiently enumerate some of those households if we have a combination of administrative records that help us understand who's living there. I like to use myself as an example here. I live in a condo in DC. I've lived there for 10 years. I'm in the ACS. I return my tax forms every year. It's easy to figure out that I'm the only person living there, and we can accurately, with high confidence, make that determination if I don't respond to the census, which is unlikely because I'm probably going to respond to the census. I hope everybody in this room feels the same way. I know the census people do. So Al will talk a little bit more about that. And then we're also re-engineered our field operations. We've moved from the paper and pencil environment that required a lot of census offices to a digital environment where people, census enumerators are using handheld devices to collect their data and submit it to the Census Bureau. They're using those handheld devices to turn over their payroll records, turn over their administrative, like the miles they've driven and such. Instead of having to receive paper assignments at like Starbucks or McDonald's and turn them back in and have them taken to an office where they're processed by clerks in that office. This is a breakthrough for us. It's a huge efficiency. It's increasing productivity. And again, Al's going to talk about that. As we moved through the decade and explored these new innovation areas, we embarked on a series of census tests. We did a total of 13 tests, which was unprecedented. We had never done so many tests. We explored every aspect of this innovative design, looking at, and tests often were pilot tests, very small, where we were looking to see how the technology and the new methodology worked. We had self-response tests where we explored some changes in the way we're doing advertising and promotion, but also testing the internet response and learning about our methodology. We had tests devoted to address canvassing and a test devoted to national content, where we looked at the different ways of framing the census questions. Margot mentioned yesterday that we test everything in the census, and that's important. We explore how well we're doing through these tests. It's the way that we understand that our methodology and our innovations are going to function effectively. These tests culminated with our end-to-end census test, which was done in 3 sites for address canvassing, and then in Providence, Rhode Island for the peak operations of the census. We tested all of the key operations and systems in the end-to-end test, and it was exciting for us that we were able to implement and execute and integrate our operations and our technologies effectively. There are a total of 35 operations in the census. 24 are the major operations that a successful test rests on. You'll hear about those operations today. There are 52 IT systems that come together to support the census. The key ones, again, were all implemented. We're now scaling up those systems as we move toward the 2020 census. Just as a matter of contrast, 10 years ago, we were frantically redesigning the census because our technology wasn't working well. Our technology is working well this time. This is a very complete test. It showed that these early operations showed that our field workers could download their assignments and then work in an internet disconnected environment, then log back into the internet and submit all their information. It worked beautifully. I also want to stress that we've been transparent about this design throughout the decade. Deirdre was the architect of our first operational plan back in 2015, I think. And that operational plan is more complete and more developed than any that we've ever produced that early in the decade, and we updated it 3 times, producing our final operational plan in early last month. That operational plan covers every aspect of the census design. It's available online. You're going to be hearing the operations we talk about today are all included in the operational plan. I encourage you to look at it if you want to explore any of these operations in more detail, if you're interested in them. We also have been completely transparent in this process. We've been conducting quarterly program management reviews that are online, that were live streamed, that were open to the general public, that were really dedicated to Congress and our oversight entities and many of the stakeholders I talked about last night, that where we walked through every element of the program as it was evolving. We walked through every test and what we were learning and how we were changing our design based on what our research and development and testing was telling us. That culminates with the successful test we just did and the final operational plan, and now we're ready to do the census. The first operation, as I said, is address list development and address canvassing, and Deirdre's going to talk about that.